All right, how are you doing, family? Peace. And I wanted to make this video talk debunking BGS ibmor on Title IX because this is something that needed to be done. BGS ibmor for years has sat up here on YouTube and he's made this claim that somehow the Title IX legislation of the 1970s, which covered gender equality, that somehow that legislation was originally supposed to be for black men, even though black men were already covered. The whole racial question was already covered with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Okay. So, what was the point of dual legislation then if they already covered black men with the 1964 Civil Rights Act? That's what the question is. Now, BGS has made this claim. Okay, I haven't seen him put forth any compelling evidence to back up his claim, other than a lot of just speculation, is what I mainly hear from him. When it regards to this, but I'm gonna go ahead and start reading. Okay, it says long title. Okay, an act to amend the Higher Education Act of 1965, the Vocational Education Act of 1963, the General Education Provisions Act, creating a national foundation for post-secondary education and a National Institute of Education, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, Public Law 874, 81st Congress, and related acts for other purposes. Okay, so it's centered around a lot of education, but I know it also centered around other things like the military, the corporate world, and stuff like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and talk about the foundations and hearings. Okay, Title IX was enacted as a follow-up to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The 1964 Act was passed to end discrimination in various fields based on race. Okay, so they already covered the racial question in the 1964 Act. Okay, color, religion, sex, or national origin in the areas of employment and public accommodation. Okay, the 1964 Act did not prohibit sex discrimination against persons employed at educational institutions. A parallel law, Title VI, had also been enacted in 1964 to prohibit discrimination in federally funded private and public entities. It covered race, color, and national origin, but excluded sex. Okay, feminists during the early 1970s lobbied Congress to add sex as a protected class category. Okay, Title IX was enacted to fill this gap and prohibit discrimination in all federally funded education programs. Congressman John Tower then proposed an amendment to Title IX that would have exempted athletic departments from the scope of Title IX's coverage. Okay, so just off of that right there, where does it say that this was specifically supposed to be for black boys? Okay, it was a follow-up to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, but it was to cover sex, whereas the 1964 Civil Rights Act covered race, creed, and nationality. Okay, so where is the documentation saying that Title IX, or the speculation saying that Title IX was supposed to specifically be for black men and boys? I don't see that. I'm going to continue reading. Okay. The Tower Amendment was rejected, but it led to widespread misunderstanding of Title IX as a sports equity law rather than anti-discrimination civil rights law. While Title IX is best known for its impacts on high school and collegiate athletics, the original statute made no explicit mention of sports. Okay? United States Supreme Court also issued decisions in the 1980s and 1990s making clear that sexual harassment and assault is a form of sex discrimination. Okay, in 2011, President Barack Obama issued guidance reminding schools of their obligation to redress sexual assault as civil rights matters under Title IX. Okay, Obama also issued guidance clarifying Title IX protections for LGBT students through Dear Colleague letters. Okay, so again, where is it saying that this was supposed to be specifically for black boys? I don't see it saying that, and I don't see anyone advocating for that, for it to be for black boys. It looks like the main people who are advocating for it were feminists. Okay, in regards to sex discrimination or discrimination based on sex. Okay, let me continue. The precursor to Title IX was an executive order issued in 1967 by President Lyndon Johnson forbidding discrimination in federal contracts. Before these orders were issued, the National Organization for Women now had persuaded him through successful lobbying or influencing his personal aides or members of Congress to include the addition of women. Okay, so women were to be in addition to it. Okay, but it never said that this was specific. It never said in the first place who or what class it was specifically for. It just said discrimination in the form of government contracts. But that's very vague. So the women, they latched themselves onto it. They want to be a part of it because they wanted some benefits from it. Okay. But I don't see anything where it says that this was specifically only supposed to be for black men and boys, and I don't see where anyone major was advocating for it. Okay, Executive Order 11375 required all entities receiving federal contracts to end discrimination on the basis of sex in hiring and employment. Okay. Again, they're talking about sex. Okay, in 1969, a notable example of its success was Bernice Sandler, who used the executive order to maintain her job and tenure at the University of Maryland. Okay, she utilized university statistics to show how female employment at the university had plummeted as qualified women were replaced by men. Okay, Sandler then brought her complaints to the Department of Labor's Office of Federal Fair Contracts Compliance, where she was encouraged to file a formal complaint, later citing inequalities in pay, rank, and admissions, among others. Okay, so again, where is it saying that the initial legislation was supposed to be for black men? I don't say that. And if it was supposed to be for black men, why were the feminists so successful in influencing Lyndon Baines Johnson to include women in the legislation? And if it was supposed to include just have black men, how come they couldn't just say black men and women in the final legislation? How come the final legislation, the final product, just focused on women? You see what I'm saying? Either okay, it was never really in the first place meant 100% for black men and boys, or the men at that time, and they always talk about the civil rights generation, how they marched and stuff. If they were supposed to be so decisive as they claim, how come they didn't stand up to the legislation and say, we demand that this be for black men and boys? Where was the push for that? Okay, because I'm not seeing that. The 1964 civil rights legislation seems to have been enough to satisfy basically the civil rights protesters at that time, because I don't see them doing enough to continue when it came to this Title IX legislation. All right, so they go on. They talk about the schools, the public universities, the implementation of it. Now, after Title IX got passed, women, they were allowed to go into a lot of other fields, corporate, law. Okay, the military. You had women in various roles in the military. Now they can be like ship captains in the Navy, or they can be fighter pilots or whatever, and officers of various ranks and stuff in the military. Okay, but this idea that this was legislation that was only supposed to be for black men. Okay, that it was supposed to provide all this vocational training. Okay, for black men and boys. Okay, when you look at the period right after slavery, and somehow black people were able to provide those things for themselves in the period right after slavery. I find that weird. But in this 1960s legislation, they're saying that they need, the government to come in and give the black boys all this vocational training so they can get jobs. And how come the black community couldn't invest in itself and get those things for itself? Okay. Now, people like BGS Itmore, the whole BGS Itmore crowd, they will go on and on and on and on about why Negroes couldn't do it for themselves, what roadblocks there were. They didn't have the time. They didn't have the capital. Okay, so they don't have the time to improve their own community. Okay. They didn't have the time to they didn't have the time to invest in their you say it was the boys that needed this legislation, so you're telling me they didn't have the time to invest in their boys? Whose fault is that then? Whose fault is that? Is that really the dominant society's fault, or is that the community? Okay, what was the community prioritizing at the time? Were they prioritizing investing in their boys, or were they prioritizing more and simply just integrating into white institutions versus building up their own human capital within their own group? You have to ask that question. That is a question that is not asked far too often. It is a question that is not asked far too often. And in this video, I'm going to ask and pose that question. Okay? And then why is it that black people, why do we have, what is this mentality that we got to depend on the government always to give us tools to uplift ourselves, when we can clearly go and get those tools ourselves and invest in ourselves? Why does that mindset exist? My theory is that mindset came from the civil rights generation. I think they came to see the government as this benevolent entity rather than an entity that is controlled and run by selfish individuals. They kind of saw it as this benevolent entity that had this moral obligation to ensure progress in the black community. But then when that progress didn't happen or it failed, okay, they didn't have much to say. Okay. So anyways, let me know what y'all think on this. I'm going to talk about this more in the future. But let me know what y'all think on this so far. Peace.